All right, well, good morning. I heard a few yahoos out there from UW. Who's from UW, anyone? I think I met Cheryl, right? So in the house, lawyers, law students, show of hands. Okay, people who don't like lawyers, don't like law students. We'll try to change that. Okay. So today I'm going to cover really what it means to be legally vegan, so to speak, and to extend the concept of what veganism means to some areas that are going to be a little delicate. And I'm going to be as respectful as I can, persuasive at the same time, but really the goal here is to be mindful about choices that we make and the downstream effects. So, and in terms of the book, and I'll just mention this later, I do have a chapter on vegan and vegetarian litigation issues, and I'll leave the book somewhere. I couldn't find a spot, but this is available to thumb through if you'd like. And I put about 4 years of my life into it, and I think I make about 10 cents an hour. So if you decide you'd like it, or you're just sort of legally inclined, I recommend it. All right, so let's get going. Veganic gardening, those of you who are familiar with the term, really involves the use or the non-use of stock, of livestock, if at all possible, and also not using animal products, say for fertilizers, blood meal or fish products, and also animal feces. And so I'm extending the term veganic gardening to veganic lawyering. And in some respects, in our occupation, we deal with feces, so to speak, with other attorneys. We put up with a lot of BS and have to navigate around it and through it. But really, at sort of the first pass level, being a vegan lawyer is, at least the way I see it, and I've been vegan now about 19 years, practicing my 20th year now. Polyester, no wool, no silk, and no leather. Thanks, Payless. Okay. So certainly you can dress without having to take from the fiber of various animals and subjecting them. But what I want to engage upon, at least initially, is a crash course in the concepts of tort liability, and to sort of extend those principles to the concepts of veganism and what we should do next. So first, there's the notion of negligence. And then I'll also talk about intentional wrongdoing, which of course is abundant in any type of examination of animal rights issues. But negligence really consists of these four doctrines, or these four elements here. There's a duty of care, a duty that is owed to another person irrespective of a contractual obligation. That duty is breached somehow, and that there's a cause in fact and a proximate, or I should say a legal cause, what we call foreseeability, that results in some harm. So you have to prove all four parts to be called negligent, okay? To break it down, duty of care, to summarize, it really means to just be mindful, to not be clumsy, to give some thought to your actions and your non-actions as to who it might impact, who it might hurt down the road. And we have evolved the concept of what that duty is in relation to, or I should say, calibrated to, the reasonable person standard. Now, I'm sure back in the 19th century, the reasonable person did not look like all people represented here today. It certainly didn't include animals. Now, it'll be interesting as a footnote here to note that there is a reasonable dog standard that has been established in the jurisprudence of, say, Illinois, where we look at dangerous dogs, and the question is whether a reasonable dog would have reacted to a particular stimulus, a provocative stimulus, in a way that makes the bite righteous, as opposed to something that would condemn that dog to a horrible status for the rest of his life. So there is a reasonable person standard, but it changes. And what I want to talk about, sort of what's a reasonable vegan standard, we'll get to that though. The next element is breach. This image pretty much shows it. A breach can occur through acts of commission, like texting while driving, or acts of omission, by failing to exercise due care. So for instance, I live up in Bellingham, Washington, pretty close to the Canadian border, and the weather's probably similar to San Francisco, 20 degrees cooler today, and there's quite a bit of humidity, and so if you're rushing out the door and you can't see out of the front or the back and you just take your chances, that omission might result in someone getting maimed or killed. And that would certainly be negligence, and it could be worse. It could even be reckless. But we're only talking about bare negligence at this point, or inattentiveness, if you want to think of it that way. Causation is a huge sticky wicket. We call it proximate cause, but proximate cause is broken down into two respects. In this image here, the dominoes, I love watching these. You've seen them on YouTube, perhaps they go on for minutes and balls dropping and dominoes dropping and creating all sorts of images. But the notion of proximate cause, as exemplified through these dominoes, is you can knock one domino down and have no idea the scattering effects it may have throughout the world. Sort of like the butterfly effect, if you're familiar with that, or the Ray Bradbury story from the 50s. So proximate cause, cause in fact, what we call factual cause, or but for. So but for the cause, there wouldn't be these downstream effects. And then there's a legal cause that sort of reins it in, because obviously, you know, the domino falls and then another domino falls and so forth, and it might be entirely unforeseeable the effects of your singular action will have. So the law steps in and says, we're going to use public policy to cut off your liability to a point where it is, well, something that would be reasonable in the society in that time and place. What does foreseeability look like, though, when we're talking about vegan choices? The last piece of the element of negligence is damage. And so what we call negligence in the air is not actionable. You're just darn lucky. It's a near miss, if you want to think of it that way. But it's only where, for instance, if this person stepped just an inch over to the right, you'd have a real problem, and there would be negligence involved. Intent is quite a bit different, and intent involves either a desire of a particular outcome, and in some jurisdictions, we separate the intent to perform the act from the intent to cause the consequence of that act. Now, an example in Washington involves a 5-year-old boy who pulled the chair out as a prank. He pulled the chair out from under his grandmother before she sat down, and she fell and broke her hip. A lawsuit was brought against the grandson, alleging that he committed a battery because he intentionally caused an offensive or harmful contact to his grandmother. And the question was, did this boy intend that his mother or grandmother breaks her hip? It didn't matter because he intended the act which caused the consequence. Now, not all jurisdictions require just single intent. Some require the dual intent. But intent also has been discussed in the form of knowledge. Maybe you don't desire the outcome, but you know with substantial certainty that a certain consequence will result from your action. You know, in Justin's talk before, I mean, that image there with her straddling the goat, that's intentional, no doubt about it. And she's intending the act and the consequence. So critical legal thinking, a legal, vegan theory here, what does it look like? Well, we have a variety of, if you want to call them duties, and I'm not saying that veganism is univocal, there are variations, but generally speaking, it's a set of rules of abstention, essentially duties of, I should say, omission. We shall not consume animal flesh. We shall not ingest animal products or wear animal products or use the products tested on animals or enslave them for our entertainment, for instance, without their consent. Sexual assault, abuse or cruel treatment, and injury or killing. Obviously, there are situations where you have a justification to injure or kill another human being. So there shouldn't be an exception for non-human animals, for instance, if you're being attacked and you're acting out of self-defense or defense of others. But I would submit, and for the purpose of my talk today, we need to consider not just abstaining, but also the affirmative choices that we make, often out of the goodness of our hearts, to take into our homes non-human animals and give them these subjects of a life, give them a forever home. And we may also do so with human children too. But when they become our dependents, we are suddenly responsible for everything that occurs in their lives, from what they eat, to what they drink, from their shelter, sanitation, rest, exercise, psychological enrichment, relationships with others, essentially trying to endorse and support their fundamental interests, is what we can call them. Now, that's not what he looked like, of course. I love Grumpy Cat, so I threw him on there, just for a little bit of a laugh. But Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes said, "My right to swing my fist ends where your nose begins." Sort of a general doctrine of American jurisprudence. But I would ask, well, whose fists are we talking about? And again, this gets to the concept of foreseeability. And whose noses do we take into account? Now, like I said, and I don't know, the audience here, I'm not, other than knowing who's a lawyer and who's not, which doesn't give me that much information, I suspect most of us are here because we are sympathetic to the notion of reducing animal consumption or exploitation. But I will say that the topic I'm going to get into now might hit a nerve here or there. And I want to be very respectful and say I'm not trying to polarize at all. It's more just to open the dialogue about contemplative parenting and choices we make when it comes to having children or not, and having animals or not, and how we care for those animals and the lives that they take. Now, let me go back. About 10 plus years ago, and I won't name names, there were two self-proclaimed vegans, almost freakishly so, who ran a podcast. And they wanted to interview me about various issues, and one topic was the choice made by myself and my wife not to have children. And we thought that it was a vegan issue. And there were a lot of concerns that it would somehow insult a lot of the listenership, and so it was not run. I think it's time to start talking about it, though. So the fifth, so going back to Oliver Wendell Holmes, the fist and the nose. Well, the first fist we think of, if you're going to have companion animals, is the furry fist, so to speak. And the noses that they will smite. And of course, as far as kitties go, and my wife and I have 4 cats, the birds are sort of a key target, you could say, the key noses at issue. And of course, the fist compounds, right, with breeding. So the animal that one has, if one allows it to breed and allows its sexual nature to be expressed, which again gets to sort of an animal rights issue, which is should we interfere in the sexual lives of animals? My opinion is yes, we should, because we've artificially created the domestication that requires us to monitor their lives and the lives that they may bring into an existence. But you look at this, it's not just merely an arithmetic type of, or arithmetic increase, maybe not even geometric, but it can expand incredibly in a very short number of years or generations. And so a singular choice in time, generations down the road, can have dramatic impacts. Now this is something that I found last night. Professor Gregory Oken at UCLA in the geography, I believe, department, authored Environmental Impacts of Food Consumption by Dogs and Cats. It came out last year and it's on PLUS 1, and that's the link. And what he tried to do was calculate the proportion of animal-derived energy, which he measured in petajoules, that were consumed by non-human animal pets, okay, as opposed to human beings. And although there were a lot of statistical assumptions that were made, and he was quite candid and conceding that there might be some issues with the data, we get a rough feel, a gestalt, for the issue. And the issue, I put this together, and here's what I came up with. The statistic was mentioned earlier by Justin about 9 billion animals slaughtered per year in the US for food. And that's based on USDA statistics. We have around 163 million dogs and cats in the US, compared to 321 million Americans. Per his calculations, dogs and cats consume about 1/4 of the total animal-derived energy of those 9 billion. And although I suppose a lot comes down to weight and fat content and the caloric value of a meal, I would suggest here that it would mean that dogs and cats are responsible for several billion deaths per year. So those are the compounding noses. So breeding, and this is where I'm getting to the part of the talk about natalist ruminations, bringing into existence or allowing the new generations of litters of dogs and cats, as adorable as they are, creates these problems or issues. One, we know that humans and non-humans alike suffer in this life. We suffer, we become ill, we get old, we die. Those are the rules of the road. And in the process of our lives, as short as they may be, we are very likely going to inflict harm to others. It's just collateral damage. It's the interactions. In my practice, I deal with cases where dogs bite people, where dogs kill cats, where cats kill birds, where, there are all these conflicts, these collisions between non-humans and humans and non-humans and non-humans. The more we have, the more we're going to have. the traffic jam of liability. So what do we do then with respect to the dietary natures of the animals who are dependent on us to look out for them, to treat them as they would be treated if they were left to their own devices in the wild? And what do we do with their sexual natures? Do we restrict? Do we surgically alter? I'll tell you, I believe in spay-neuter all the way, but it raises a question, doesn't it? And the cycle continues. So it's an issue of Planned Parenthood for pets. Think of it that way. Now, domestication, of course, is really something that is quite artificial, human-inspired. You know, the dog here, the image here, the split image here, you know, all derived from the wolf, Canis lupus, but they are quite of a different order based on I think it was Hope's book, discussing how we domesticate them to make them more docile and receptive and yielding. And while with respect to farmed animals, that's done for the purpose of taking their lives and using their products, with respect to companion animals, it's so that they can provide us very real and important companionship, therapy, recreation, a hedonic value of life, a happiness in life. But there's this compassion paradox, isn't there? Because if we're trying to do right by their natures, and they are carnivorous, I mean, you really can't deny that, especially cats. What do you do if you want to halt the tide of blood that's going to flood in? Some have suggested you euthanize them all. You end the lives of the dogs and cats, and they won't be taking billions of other lives, and so forth, and so forth. Well, that would seem to conflict with at least one of the vegan imperatives, which is not to take animal lives, but stop breeding. At least you stop the flow there. And of course, try, if they'll consent to it, try vegan diets or vegetarian diets. It can be done. Now, these two books, Obligate Carnivore, second edition, came out. Cats, Dogs, and What It Really Means to Be Vegan, on the one hand. On the other hand, Eichen has Cheeseburger. All right? And the concept that taurine, and taurine is of course critical for at least fetal development, and you're not going to be able to get that just from plants and vegetables per se, but it can be handled through some type of synthesis or additives. So what does it mean? We're here at a conscious eating conference. But not just consciously eating as human beings, but what does it mean for our animals, our companion animals, to eat consciously, and for us to furnish that food for them? Now, at first I thought this was a spoof. I didn't think this was real. But apparently about 5 years ago, the Herald Sun had an article about a vegan kitten nearly dying. And the article quotes the hospital veterinarian, Leanne Pinfold, who says, "Concern for animal welfare has to include a biologically appropriate diet. You can't force your ideology on your cat." It is a real, and you've heard this, of course, news articles trying to condemn vegan parents who supposedly harmed their children. And in fact, some children have died, very, very few. But that's probably because of just not feeding them enough. It's not an issue of, or feeding them just, you know, one thing complete, like apple juice only. Yeah, what do you expect is going to happen? But, you know, this is sort of the counterpoint, and I think we get, at least I get so wrapped up into veganism and how it, you know, motivates one's life, while being very homocentric in the analysis, without thinking about the other species who are quite different from us and how they live in the world naturally. I mean, you see images of, I mean, what are the statistics? The Audubon Society talks about wild cats, or even just cats who are allowed to be indoor outdoor, claiming the lives of plenty of songbirds. Now, I tend to, I see both sides, so I'm not just taking the bird side, but I do think it's very important to keep cats in, of course, from roaming because of that precise reason. But what I want to introduce you to is this, the 5 freedoms of animal welfare. And this has been adopted by, well, look at that, San Francisco SPCA, but it was adopted by the ASPCA, the RSPCA, the World Organization for Animal Health. And it was originally created in 1979 by the UK Farm Animal Welfare Council at the urging of the government in Britain, and they came up with what they thought would be the 5 key freedoms for animals under human control, not wild. Freedom for hunger and thirst, by ready access to fresh water and diet to maintain full health and vigor. Can a cat, fed a vegan diet, maintain full health and vigor? Freedom from discomfort by providing an appropriate environment, including shelter and a comfortable resting area. Freedom from pain, injury, or disease by prevention or rapid diagnosis and treatment. UTIs, male cats. Freedom to express normal behavior by providing sufficient space, proper facilities, and company of the animal's own kind. And freedom from fear and distress by ensuring conditions and treatment which avoid mental suffering. So the ethical question, and maybe even the legal question, is if you force a carnivore, an obligate carnivore, to have a diet that they reject, and as a result they suffer and they decompensate and they become diseased and they die, is that animal cruelty? Is it vegan? No. I thought it was a bit ironic that one of the big arguments that are raised as to why human beings are not meant to eat meat is to use the foil of the carnivore, specifically the cat, largely, to say, look, here's what a carnivore looks like. It's the cat. And yet, that's the very species that we are now trying to claim should also avoid eating meat. That's a tough position to take. Again, though, why not try? There are a number of products for cats and for dogs that are vegan, that synthesize or add the necessary ingredients like taurine for cats. I think it's much easier with dogs than with cats. But these are various products. And it's probably easier to start them very young. But if you're going to have a cat or a dog who is simply going to reject every effort you've made, what do you do? I would say if you have to feed meat or meat products, at least spay and neuter. At least stop that process from cycling through. Now, let's go to the other issue. Remember the fist in the nose. Having a child, the fist. Animals killed to feed the child, the nose. Do you know who this guy is? I didn't know until last night. Yes, I put my PowerPoint together last night. This is a sexy vegan. That's what he calls himself, and he tattooed it on his face. And he was on Dr. Phil, and I don't know. He's just an interesting character. You have interesting people in the movement, right? But one argument you hear is vegans raising children who are going to be vegan, at least while under parental control, may be the next vegan messiah. You know, they might have untold effects, unforeseeable effects that will change the way the world operates. Maybe, but I'm a bit cynical. Like I said with animals, we will become ill, we will age, we will suffer, we will die, every one of us. And except for a few exceptions, the children we raise, once they leave our control, are going to act according to their perceived dietary natures, which in this society is going to be meat, meat, dairy, dairy. Okay? And so maybe initially they'll be vegan for a while, but the odds are, and I'll show with statistics, they're going to lapse, and they're going to raise other kids who are also going to lapse or not even be veg or vegan. And the people who brought them into existence, they're the cause. That's the effect. Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus, is a very, we know this mostly from the movies. I don't know if anyone's actually, has anyone read Shelley's book? Yeah. I mean, it's a fascinating story. This was a book came out back in the 1800s, I believe. It's about Victor Frankenstein, a scientist, who wanted to create, he was a reanimator. And in the creation, though, his creation, whom was called the atom of your labors, or of his labors, or the fallen angel, ended up taking the lives of people very dear to Dr. Frankenstein. And at some point, Frankenstein, who was really adrift in society, ended up committing suicide. It's a quite sad, deeply sad story, but it's a harbinger, really, for, I guess, the issues I'm raising here. Vegan parents or anyone having children, in a way, you're creating a Frankenstein. You don't know what this individual is going to be like 10, 20 years from now after you die. You don't know what's going to happen. And then having animals and allowing them to breed, in some way, you are playing Frankenstein. So going back to causation issues, talked about factual cause and legal cause. Factual cause is but for. But for the act, we would not see the consequence. But for allowing animals to breed, it's certain that they and their offspring to come will not claim animal and human lives or cause suffering. But for having children, the same can be said. But legal causation is the other issue. Should we assign fault? And I don't mean to make this sort of a sin issue or a fault issue. That'll polarize. But I'm just using this sort of as a rhetorical tool. Is there a foreseeability that can be cut off, and so we could call it too attenuated to assign liability or fault or responsibility, moral responsibility for what happens? In the law, there's a concept of superseding intervening cause. So what it says is that the chain of causation, the dominoes dropping, can be blocked or interrupted by a vehicle driving right in and cutting off that path and creating a new causal line of dominoes to fall, which would then vitiate liability from the original person who pushed the first domino. But that only applies if that vehicle, say, driving in and breaking the chain, was unforeseeable. And I would submit, everything I've told you is foreseeable. We have 7.6 billion people and counting on the planet. Global warming, except for a few in our administration, is undeniable. According to Center for Biological Diversity, we have caused the 6th mass extinction of various plants and animals. But the state of science, and I'd say of ethics, allows us to foresee these impacts. And I think I don't think we can claim ignorance. I don't think we can assume that, hey, it's what I want. Because, what do you hear? What's the main argument with veganism, anti-veganism? Well, I just really like bacon. I really like cheese. Okay. But sometimes you have to use discipline, find alternatives, and change. Kant, it's been so many years since I was in college and took philosophy classes, so I may not get this right, and those of you here are sure more familiar with the deontological imperative. But Kant came up with this illustration of a train that is coming forward down a track and will certainly result in the deaths of several individuals. A whole town, I think, was the example. But you have the ability to step in there and change the tracks. And if you change the tracks, you will save that town. But you know you're going to kill maybe 2 people at the other end of that second track. Do you switch the tracks? Now, the utilitarians would, of course, say, of course. We calculate sort of the reasonableness calculus of suffering and pleasure and all of that. And when you run the numbers, the odds are it's better to just kill 1 or 2 people as opposed to a whole town. But the deontologists would say, no, there's something categorical here that is prohibiting us from acting regardless of how many lives may be saved. And so what I would submit here is that the decision to breed or not breed, or with respect to animals, or have children or not have children, is a similar question, is a similar Kantian question. So let's look at the numbers. The vegan calculator will tell you, based on their data, how many animal lives you've saved, how many pounds of CO2 you've reduced, how many pounds of meat you've taken off the scale, but depending on how long you've been vegan. According to this, in a 70-year period, you will save 14,140 animals. And USA Today was so inspired by this that a couple of years ago, they ran an article that said, holy cow, meat eaters consume 7,000 animals in a lifetime. And they broke it down into those cows, pigs, chickens, and so forth. Obviously, chickens are the largest, the birds are the largest numbers of lives claimed. So the average kills per human, if you want to think of it that way, is about 7,000. Then, how many children does the average US woman have? According to, and I want to say, I don't think it's a question of vegan or not vegan to have a child. It's not like you're consuming an animal product, unless you're feeding them or raising them or clothing them with animal products, then it becomes an issue. But the data suggest that it's reduced, at least in the US, not in other parts of the world. But we're at about replacement of parents, so around 2. Now that's 2010, but the data are now around 2.2 according to an NCHS data brief coming out a couple of years ago with birth expectations And it also concluded that about half of all US women aged 15 to 44 expect to have a child in the future. So you take that data, take the other data, and then you take this. Faunalytics, anyone familiar with Faunalytics? It's a great website, I mean, amazing. So Che Green, I've known for many years, and Che is the executive director of it, and it's in Olympia, Washington, so I'm proud about that. Faunalytics has all sorts of data, infographics, very useful, very accessible website. This is one of the infographics about lapsed vegans, lapsed vegetarians. And what it says is that when they took their poll, there were 12.1% of the US population was either a current vegetarian or vegan or a former, a recovering, some of them say. Okay? What does that mean, though? Well, they drilled down a little bit more. It means that 84.3% of the 12.1 current and former vegetarians and vegans have sort of fallen off the wagon, okay? They've rejected it. 84%. And that 86% of the vegetarians lapse, while 70 of the vegans do, which is an interesting statistic. It tells me that people who become vegan initially are probably going to stick with it a little more, but 70% is not a figure I get sanguine about. However, there is sort of a re-entry statistic, which is around 37% saying that they would re-adopt it. So, how do you get people back? And how do you not lose them to follow up? This here is Professor Hal Herzog, or Dr. Herzog. I don't know if he's a professor. That's not his quote. It's his daughter, actually. And this was an article that was based on this report that came out in 2014. 84% of vegetarians and vegans return to meat. Why? And he has some interesting thoughts. But one is his daughter wrote him this. I stopped eating meat when I was 13. I told my mom and dad that my decision was based on animal welfare and the high carbon footprint of meat. But the truth is that while I theoretically cared about animals and the planet, mostly I just wanted to be different. I lived in a small southern town where it was more common to see the image of Jesus in a piece of toast than encounter a real-life vegetarian. So while my motives weren't entirely pure, giving up meat certainly made me different. Population of Chloe, where is that, Justin? 9427 meat eaters and 1 vegetarian. For the next 17 years, I ate grains, produce, legumes, and fake meat products like those Morningstar bacon strips that have a lower nutritional value than cat food. And for the next 17 years, it seemed like I was always hungry, no matter how large my bowl of beans and rice. Even worse than constant hunger, I didn't seem to enjoy food the way other people did. Well, she hasn't come to California. Eating was a chore, like folding laundry or paying bills. But even more annoying, because if I didn't do it, I would die. I was sick of being hungry. I was sick of beans and rice. So at the age of 31, I've made a decision. I will try and become a meat eater. Okay. But this is real. And this is something that we as a movement need to really understand and address. Another statistic, this came out 2009, Oregon State University, 2 professors, Murtaugh and Schlacks. I don't know if Schlacks is a professor, but I know Murtaugh is. In global environmental change. And it just talks about the environmental impact of having a child. It's probably the largest environmental impact you could have, putting aside vegan issues. They said that the average child adds 9441 metric tons of carbon dioxide to the carbon legacy of the average parent, and that for the parent who has a child, they're going to be responsible for 5.7 times the lifetime emissions of the female who doesn't have a child. And that the impact of that extra kid is going to be 20 times greater than really everything else. Driving an electric vehicle, using low energy light bulbs, LEDs, low flush toilets like in there, all of that, recycling, it ain't gonna make much of a difference compared to having a kid. So when you put all of this together, and there's some more, I'm gonna have to keep moving because I'm running out of time. When you put all this together, it does raise some questions, which is it better I don't wanna use natalism, anti-natalism, that sort of polarization, being anti doesn't help the dialogue. I'd say sort of conscientious issues in parenting choices. Do we or do we not? Do we adopt children like we adopt dogs and cats, or do we breed or bring into existence children? David Benatar was showcased last year in the New Yorker, and the article was The Case for Not Being Born. I didn't even know about Benatar until I read that article. It's a good article. And Benatar has written a number of books. One was Better Never to Have Been, The Harm of Coming into Existence, and he just came out with one called The Human Predicament. And he's taking it, I think, from a pretty strictly utilitarian perspective. And I don't have time to go into it now, but it's worth reading. He's from the University of Cape Town in South Africa. But what's interesting is that I think he's vegan because in the New York article, when Rothman and Benatar went to lunch, he wanted a vegan restaurant. So, AV, anyone know who that is? Yeah, that would work. Antinatalist vegans. Apparently there's even a group of antinatalist vegans out there, so you can go check that out. All right. Total aside, this is just because I think it's interesting, and maybe you will too. In the law, we have the concept, and this is an extension of negligence and duties of care. Wrongful life, wrongful birth, wrongful conception. A little mind-blowing lesson this morning. Wrongful life is a cause of action that a child has claiming she should never have been born. Now, most U.S. courts don't allow it, but where I come from, they do. And that's the case, Harbison versus Park Davis, 1983 Supreme Court case. Wrongful birth belongs to the parents, essentially saying that they didn't get proper genetic counseling from the doctors before giving birth, and the expenses and the issues that arise from that. In having what they call a defective child. I'm just quoting from it, those are my words. Wrongful conception or wrongful pregnancy pertains to giving birth to a healthy child caused by a breach of a duty to the parents, basically saying, hey, look, we never thought we'd get pregnant, why did this happen? So those are all of the sort of claims that can be made in this area. And it just made me think, well, could you link up wrongful conception with wrongful death of all the animals and other human lives that may fall as a result of these birthing choices? So the parallels, I think, are there. We preach it, spay neuter. Am I saying spay neuter people? No, but some people do. And then adopt. Why not? We have overpopulation. Open the homes. What a loving gesture. Adopt animals, adopt children. Give them a good life. Raise them vegan. That will have an impact. Next subject. How much time do I have? 15 minutes? I think I'm pretty sure. I want to talk about 5 minutes? Oh, okay, 7, oh boy. Okay, this is going to be crazy. False advertising, conscientious objection. I'm going to blast through some of this. Okay. Anyone ever know about corn products? Okay. I always thought they had egg. I never thought they were vegan, but I guess they have a vegan line. Anyway, they got sued 2 years ago in California, class action, saying that, in fact, it's deceptive advertising, calling microproteins sort of mushroom products when, in fact, it's mold. At least that's what the allegations were. So they settled, and there's a settlement there if you've bought these products for buying what you thought was sort of microprotein when they're calling it mold. Okay. So what I want to show is this is sort of the backlash on sort of vegan or vegetarian food products. We're seeing now the other industries circling around and getting quite defensive and protective, like the efforts by Unilever, the manufacturer of Hellmann's Mayo, suing Just Mayo, Hampton Creek, for advertising they have mayo which has no eggs in it, which isn't mayo, right? So it's confusing to the public. They may buy a vegan product expecting they're going to have animals in it. And other lawsuits brought by dairy producers against almond milk, rice milk, other producers saying that that's not really milk. The FDA definition of milk is lacteal secretion from more than one bovine, and obviously you're not milking almonds, so okay. Just so you know, corn case, there was a very sad case of a boy, 11 years old, who did die from anaphylaxis after having a corn product. I don't know if it was the vegan one. I'm just throwing an image up there. But apparently he had been hospitalized 10 plus times before for asthma. So I don't know if the cause was the product or what, but anyway, these are issues that everyone's going to have to deal with as the vegan market expands. Then, anyone know Cafe Gratitude? Okay, so there's an ethical issue here, right? I mean, I think this goes a little bit too far. The products there are still vegan, as far as I know, at both of those locations. But the founders, who have been veg for 40 years, suddenly embraced humane, methods of killing animals on their farm at the Be Love Farm, hence Be Kill Farm, which is what some activists wrote. And so there was an article in the LA Eater, came out a couple years ago, about death threats and so forth. Okay. Ethical issues of how far do we go? Now, one of the key cases involving false advertising with products, and I don't think the Cafe Gratitude is that at all, because the products are. But the McDonald's French fry case came out of Seattle. Harish Bharti was the plaintiff's lawyer, and he brought a class action in King County, Seattle, against McDonald's, saying that they were misleading his Hindu clients, who were vegetarian, into believing that the fries were vegetarian at least, and in fact they weren't. They were sort of laced in lard product. And so McDonald's apologized, and there was a settlement. That's one of the earliest cases. These are the types of claims that can be made, generally speaking, in these false advertising matters. Again, I can't, this will be posted online, or I can give you the PowerPoint, but I want to keep moving. Agencies that you can report these claims to, typically the FTC looks into consumer protection for false and deceptive advertising, USDA, FDA, and you can complain to even the Better Business Bureau and Advertising Review Board. They're non-governmental entities, but they can try to take a whack at these groups that are taking advantage of vegetarians and vegans. I'm going to skip that. Gupta versus Asia Enterprises. This is a 2011 New Jersey case involving 16 Hindus who ended up getting samosas from the Mogul Express. And they were assured it would be vegetarian, there would be no meat filling. And even it said veg samosas on it, and they brought them home. They were eating them, they thought, no, something's fishy here. They called in, said, are you sure? Oh, yes, there's no meat. And then they still were unclear about it, and they went in and spoke to one of the managers and said, oh, actually, we just had an order for meat-filled samosas, and we think we got them mixed up. And so, no, it was meat, but here's a whole other set, free, no charge. I'm so sorry. They brought a lawsuit. And the claim, and this has been criticized by others in the Hindu community, saying that it was sort of manipulating the religion in a way that was inappropriate, but saying that they had a spiritual injury and an emotional injury. The spiritual injury being that they now had to purify by going to the Ganges River in India at extreme expense, and they wanted to be reimbursed for that. Well, the trial court threw the case out. Court of Appeals reversed and said, no, there are some valid claims here, but you're not going to get spiritual injury, and you have no evidence of mental or emotional distress, so you can't bring a negligent infliction claim. Okay. Another case, Popovich, this is out of, I think, LA, involving Denny's. Milena Popovich got a veggie omelet using egg beaters with tomatoes and mushrooms, but the plate came with pork sausage. She's not sure she ate any. She thought they were mushrooms. She got upset, became nauseated, started crying, was shaking, ended up locking herself in the bedroom, went to the ER later. The treating physician said it was probably food poisoning that caused the nausea. It wasn't the consumption of an animal product. She sued. The case was dismissed. The Court of Appeals in California threw it out as well, saying that she had no physical injury to speak of. So the lesson here is this. If you're going to go to a place and they defraud you in this way or deceive you in this way, then there needs to be some type of physical manifestation of the injury in most cases. Not always, but that would help prove up the claim. Okay, religion, hardly any time. Sorry. I wanted to talk about sort of the evolution of veganism as a religion, and really begs the question, should it be a religion? Do we want to go there? Because it's too easy for people to say, well, that's not my religion, you know. Because it's not it doesn't have to be religious. It can be buttressed by religion, but it isn't. Bottom line, First Amendment is fairly broad in allowing for sincerely held beliefs that hold the place similar to a theistic religion or a traditional religion. Those are protected under our First Amendment. We also have Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, which protects against discrimination based on a variety of variables, including religion. And the EEOC, which is the federal agency that enforces the Civil Rights Act, also has defined religion quite broadly, including a man who was fired because he believed in cold fusion. And that was apparently a belief system that justified a discrimination claim. I wish Jerry were here. I think he's down in LA. Jerry Friedman has been an ethical vegan forever, and he brought two big lawsuits in California, one against Kaiser Permanente and other against Merck, claiming that he was forced to get a mumps vaccine to keep his job, and that violated his ethical principles, and also that there was some deception involved in the actual production of the vaccine. His case, forced California courts to take a look at how they define religious creed. And essentially, they applied this test called the Africa test. And the Africa test held that ethical veganism is not a religion under California's Fair Employment and Housing Act. And mostly because it didn't address human existence, purpose of life, other theories that were broader than just a singular set of dictates. No apparent spiritual or otherworldly component. There are other cases, of course, that talk about Seventh-day Adventism. This is out of San Diego. Bus driver in 1996 was vegan. He didn't want to give out Carl's Jr. hamburger coupons. He was fired for insubordination. He said, look, I'll put them in a basket. People can take them. He was still fired. They settled for 50 grand. The EEOC said it is a religion. Yay. Okay, that was 20 years ago. There's some other cases of vaccine which I can't talk about now. I think I'm out of time. Oh, no. Okay. Ah, shoot. I think I'm out of time. Well, there's more fun in store. So anyway, I'm available. Thank you for your attentiveness.